Persuasion. In 1985, "Don't Mess with Texas" bumper stickers began appearing on cars in Texas, beginning the launch of what turned out to be the most successful anti-littering campaign ever conducted in the United States. The campaign, commissioned by the Texas Department of Transportation, was aimed at reducing the cost of picking up roadside litter. Research showed that the main culprits were young male truck drivers. Aware of the demographic they were targeting, the advertising team had an epiphany. Since most Texans associate the word litter with a group of puppies or kittens, a campaign on littering wasn't going to work. The campaign needed a motto that would resonate with the likes of the rough and tumble males who thought nothing of throwing their empty beer cans out their truck windows. The slogan "Don't Mess with Texas" was born. The slogan not only fit the sensibilities of the target demographic, it also capitalized on a well-known fact: enormous Texan pride. The team astutely recruited well-known masculine icons to disseminate the anti-littering message. Members of the Dallas Cowboys, singers such as Willie Nelson and Lyle Lovett, and the actor Matthew McConaughey were among the first to participate. The spokespersons for the campaign did not plead. Instead, rugged football players looked sternly into the camera as they crushed beer cans, threw them into the garbage, and proclaimed, "Don't mess with Texas." The "Don't Mess with Texas" campaign is a legendary success story in the world of advertising. Outline: dual process approach to persuasion. The elements of persuasion: metacognition and persuasion, the media and persuasion, resistance to persuasion. The "Don't Mess with Texas" campaign is also a story about the psychology of persuasion, how to influence people's attitudes and behaviors. The campaign's success suggests that large numbers of people can be persuaded, something we have seen throughout history. Charismatic leaders such as Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., and Mohandas Mahatma Gandhi have stirred the masses and brought about radical social change, even when lacking significant institutional power or money. And in 2014, the Ice Bucket Challenge, a promotional strategy aimed at combating the neurodegenerative condition ALS, became a craze that spread worldwide. In addition to raising awareness about the disease, the campaign persuaded people to donate, ultimately taking in over $115 million, which funded groundbreaking research. People, however, can be remarkably resistant to persuasion. Many well-designed, well-funded efforts to encourage people to practice safe sex, stop using drugs, or improve their diet have failed. People can be stubbornly resistant to changing their minds, even when their health or economic well-being is affected. This chapter will examine both of these truths. We can be markedly susceptible to persuasion, but also impressively resistant to it. Don't Mess with Texas. Advertising success. In 1985, on behalf of the Texas Department of Transportation, an advertising agency launched an anti-littering campaign centered around the slogan, "Don't Mess with Texas." This successful strategy reduced litter by 72% within 6 years. The trademarked slogan shown here has inspired books, songs, and political speeches and still remains an iconic symbol of Texas pride. Dual process approach to persuasion. Over 90% of the scientific community believe that people are the cause of the warming of the Earth's atmosphere and that global warming will likely yield catastrophic events: hurricanes that dwarf Irma, rising sea levels that will place parts of the U.S. South and many tropical islands underwater, rampant wildfires, and the disappearance of thousands of species. It's also clear that each of us can do many things to cut down our own carbon emissions, a primary source of global warming. Here are just a few. We can drive our cars less and rely more on bikes or public transportation. We can fly less often to our vacation destinations. We can eliminate red meat from our diet. You'd be surprised how much that can help. We can use energy-efficient light bulbs, toilets, heating systems, and solar panels, all of which right now cost more than the conventional options but will yield many benefits in the long run. We can turn off computers and lights when not in use. We can buy local produce or grow our own food, which helps reduce carbon emissions because trucking isn't required to deliver the food. Imagine you're leading a public service campaign to persuade people to adopt these habits. Doing so might not be as difficult as, say, getting people to change their sexual practices to curb AIDS, which some African countries tried with limited success. Still, there are plenty of barriers to modifying attitudes and behavior related to cutting carbon emissions. People would have to alter old habits, driving their cars, give up strong preferences, double cheeseburgers, and adjust their daily routine, taking extra time to use public transportation or bike to work. What kind of campaign would you design? The literature on persuasion suggests that there is no simple, one-solution-fits-all means of persuasion. Instead, social psychologists propose that there are two basic ways to persuade people, or two routes to persuasion. The object of oratory alone is not truth, but persuasion. Thomas Babington Macaulay. Men are not governed by justice, but by law or persuasion. When they refuse to be governed by law or persuasion, they have to be governed by force or fraud, or both. George Bernard Shaw. Elaboration likelihood model. In the 1980s, Richard Petty and John Cacapio developed the elaboration likelihood model, ELM, to explain how people change their attitudes in response to persuasive messages. The core idea is that people in certain contexts process persuasive messages rather mindlessly and effortlessly, and on other occasions, deeply and attentively. Does this notion of dual processes sound familiar? It should. It's analogous to the distinction we made in Chapter 4 between automatic and controlled processing. When applied to persuasion, the key insight is that some types of persuasive appeals will be more effective when the target audience is largely on autopilot, and other types will be more effective when the target audience is alert and attentive. Indeed, the very name elaboration likelihood model captures the idea that in trying to predict whether a persuasive message will be effective, it's essential to know whether the target audience is likely to elaborate, think deeply about the message, or process it mindlessly. Elaboration likelihood model, ELM, a model of persuasion maintaining that there are two different routes to persuasion, the central route and the peripheral route. According to the ELM, the central route to persuasion occurs when people think carefully and deliberately about the content of a persuasive message, Figure 8.1. They attend to the logic and strength of the arguments and evidence presented in the message. They rely on relevant information of their own, experiences, memories, and knowledge to evaluate the message. Whether or not all of this high-effort thinking or elaboration of the message leads to attitude change, there's a careful sifting of the arguments and evidence presented. Through the ELM's peripheral route, people primarily attend to peripheral aspects of a message, relatively superficial, easy-to-process features of a communication that are tangential to the persuasive information itself. A peripheral cue might be the apparent expertise, credibility, or attractiveness of the person communicating a persuasive message. To be sure, some of these peripheral cues, such as the communicator's expertise or credibility, can be a form of evidence when processed in a deliberate, thoughtful fashion. But when persuasion occurs through the peripheral route, the person is swayed by these cues without engaging in much thought. Central route, a route to persuasion wherein people think carefully and deliberately about the content of a persuasive message, attending to its logic and the strength of its arguments, as well as to related evidence and principles. Peripheral route, a route to persuasion wherein people attend to relatively easy to process, superficial cues related to a persuasive message, such as its length or the expertise or attractiveness of the source of the message. Figure 8.1, dual process approach to persuasion. According to Petty and Cacioppo's elaboration likelihood model, there are two routes to persuasion, a central route and a peripheral route. The routes are engaged by different levels of motivation and ability to attend to the message, and different types of persuasive appeals are more effective through one route than through the other. Any persuasion variable, such as a source's expertise, can bring about attitude change through either or both central and peripheral routes to persuasion. So in the central process, you begin with motivation and ability factors. The issue is personally relevant, and you're knowledgeable in the domain. The factors promoting attitude change are the quality of the argument. Now, in the peripheral process, the motivation and ability factors are The issue is not personally relevant. You are distracted or fatigued, and it's an incomplete or hard to comprehend message. The factors promoting attitude change are source attractiveness, fame, expertise, number and length of arguments, consensus. In the peripheral route, people rely on relatively simple heuristics or rules of thumb that guide them in how to respond to a persuasive message. Thus, a person's attitude toward red meat might change simply because an expert says it's bad to eat it, there are many arguments against eating it, or a lot of people don't eat it. Or a peripheral cue might change a person's emotional reaction to the attitude object, the focus of the persuasive appeal, leading to a change in attitude on this basis alone. If the source of a message is attractive, for instance, this might make the person feel more positively about the attitude object simply by eliciting general feelings of liking or attraction that rub off on the object itself. You're right, it does sound a powerful message. The guy's wearing a Viking outfit in a suit shop. The roles of motivation and ability. What determines whether we will engage in central or peripheral processing in response to a persuasive message? Two factors matter, motivation and ability. See Figure 8.1. In terms of our motivation to devote time and energy to a message, when the message has personal consequences, it bears on our goals, interests, or well-being, we're more likely to go the central route and carefully work through the arguments and relevant information. In terms of our ability to process the message in depth, when we have sufficient cognitive resources and time, we're able to process persuasive messages more deeply. In general, the more we know, the more thoughtful we're able to scrutinize a persuasive message. In contrast, when ability is low, for example, the arguments in a persuasive message are being presented too quickly or are hard to comprehend, we're more apt to rely on easy-to-process peripheral cues associated with the message, such as the credentials of the message source. Being tired or distracted also makes peripheral processing more likely. The upshot is that for persuasion to occur via the central route, we have to be both motivated and able to engage in more in-depth processing. If either is lacking, persuasion generally relies on peripheral cues. In a typical experiment testing the ELM, researchers first generate strong and weak arguments for an attitude issue or object. They then present these arguments as part of a persuasive message. They also vary the potency of various peripheral cues associated with the message, such as the number of arguments offered or the credibility or attractiveness of the source of the message. Finally, they vary a factor, such as the personal relevance of the issue, to manipulate the likelihood that the participants will process the message centrally or peripherally. If participants process the message via the central route because the issue has a great deal of personal relevance, they should be sensitive to the strength of the arguments, swayed when the arguments are strong, but not when they're weak. In contrast, participants who are low in motivation or ability, or both, would be unlikely to discern the strength of the arguments because they're only noticing peripheral cues of the message, so whether or not they change their minds is less affected by argument strength. Of the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, there are three kinds. The first kind depends on the personal character of the speaker, the second on putting the audience into a certain frame of mind, the third on the proof provided by the words of the speech itself. Aristotle. Box 8.1. Not so fast. Critical thinking about external validity. In 1990, the rock band Judas Priest was tried for contributing to the suicide deaths of Ray Belknap and James Vance. Prosecutors alleged that the men had been led down the path to suicide by the subliminal message "Do It" that the band had embedded into one of its songs. Can subliminal messages have such powerful effects? Can they be the basis of a non-conscious, peripheral route to persuasion? Subliminal stimuli presented below conscious awareness, can activate certain concepts and even shape everyday thoughts, feelings, and actions. Consider a laboratory experiment in which participants saw pictures of a target person immediately after being subliminally presented with a pleasant image, such as a child playing with a doll, or an unpleasant one, such as a bloody shark. Upon later evaluation of the target person, those who were subliminally exposed to positive images provided more favorable evaluations than those exposed to negative images. In another study, Participants were told not to drink anything for 3 hours before coming to the experiment. Upon arrival, half the participants were allowed to quench their thirst and half were kept thirsty. All of them were then subliminally primed, some with words related to thirst, dry, and some with neutral words, pirate, one. They were then allowed to drink as much as they wanted of each of 2 beverages. Thirsty participants who were primed with thirst-related words drank significantly more than thirsty participants primed with neutral words. As expected, the primes had no influence on those who weren't thirsty. Findings like these are provocative and attest to the potential influence of subliminal messages on our decisions and behaviors. But are they cause for alarm? Do we need to be on constant alert for the possibility that advertisers, political campaign managers, or rock bands might try to alter our behavior with messages we aren't consciously aware of having seen? Maybe not. Recall Chapter 2's discussion of internal and external validity. Laboratory experiments of subliminal persuasion score high on internal validity, but considerably lower on external validity. In other words, the outside world and the lab differ in a number of important ways that make subliminal effects weaker in daily life. The focus of the persuasion attempt in the lab is typically something people have no firm opinion about, such as a new sports drink. It's one thing to shift attitudes and behavior with respect to neutral stimuli. It's another thing entirely to shift attitudes and behavior with respect to more familiar, psychologically significant stimuli, such as getting Republicans to vote for a Democratic candidate. In addition, the subliminal message in lab studies is presented right before assessment of the target attitude or behavior, and the participants encounter no competing messages in the interim. That's almost never the case in the real world. A subliminal command to drink Coke could conceivably motivate people to leave their seats to get a drink, but once in the lobby, surrounded by all sorts of messages, they might be as likely to drink Pepsi as Coke or even get a candy bar. In fact, no studies have ever demonstrated that subliminal stimuli induce people to do something they are opposed to doing. There's no reason to believe that being subliminally primed with the words "do it" would lead those not already accustomed to the idea of suicide to kill themselves. The relevant lesson is that while experiments can shed light on potential attitudes and behaviors, while revealing a lot about how the mind works in the process, broad conclusions about the likelihood of a behavior or outcome occurring in daily life require a thoughtful consideration of the external validity of the body of experimental evidence. Subliminal advertising. In a television ad run by the Republicans during the 2000 U.S. presidential election, the word rats was quickly flashed on the screen in a subliminal attack on Al Gore, the Democratic candidate, and his Medicare plan. So you can see something saying the Gore prescription plan, bureaucrats decide, and rats subliminally behind it. Given this reasoning, consider one study that varied the strength of the arguments, the personal relevance of the issue, and a peripheral cue, the expertise of the person delivering the persuasive message. Participants read either 8 weak arguments or 8 strong arguments in support of implementing a policy to require a comprehensive exam for all graduating seniors at their university. Personal relevance was manipulated by telling the participants the policy would be initiated either the following year, meaning they would have to take the exam, or in 10 years, presumably well after the student's graduation. Finally, source expertise was varied. Half the participants were told the arguments were generated by a local high school class, and half were told the arguments were generated by the Carnegie Commission on Higher Education, allegedly chaired by a Princeton University professor. Take a look at Figure 8.2a. Higher values along the vertical y-axis indicate more favorable attitudes toward the comprehensive exam, whereas lower values indicate less favorable attitudes. You can see that when the message was personally relevant to the students, that is, when the exam was to be implemented the next year and these students would have to take it, they were motivated to pay attention to the strength of the arguments. But for students for whom the message was not personally relevant, they wouldn't have to take the test themselves. The strength of the arguments didn't matter as much. These participants noticed, and were mainly influenced by, the expertise of the source, whether the arguments were produced by a high school class or by a professorial committee, Figure 8.2b. Figure 8.2, Central or Peripheral Route to Persuasion. Attitude change can be brought about by A, strong arguments when people are motivated, and B, by the expertise of the source of the persuasive message when people aren't motivated. Strong arguments lead to more attitude change for participants to whom the issue is personally relevant than for those to whom the issue is not relevant. The expertise of the source of the communication, in contrast, matters more for participants to whom the issue is not personally relevant, suggesting that they mainly attend to peripheral aspects of the message. So you can see the post-communication attitude toward the comprehensive exam. When people find the exam personally relevant, for strong arguments they feel very positive, and for weak arguments they feel very negative, whereas if it's not personally relevant, people don't feel very strongly when it's a strong argument or very strongly negative when it's a weak argument. Post-communication attitude toward comprehensive exam. In this graph, you can see that when it's personally relevant, people are slightly positive about the argument when there's an expert source, and people who find it personally relevant are not very positive at all when it's a non-expert source. But when the argument is not personally relevant to the participant, they're almost twice as much more positive than the personally relevant people about having an expert communicate it, and they're quite negative about having a non-expert communicate the argument. Students who would theoretically have to take the test the following year were far less influenced by whether or not the source was an expert and more persuaded by strong than by weak arguments. In short, high personal relevance led participants to be persuaded by the strength of the arguments, the central route to persuasion, whereas a lack of personal relevance led participants to be persuaded by the expertise of the source, the peripheral route to persuasion. It's worth noting, though, that persuasion variables, such as argument strength and source expertise, are not tied to a single persuasion route. In fact, the variables can play multiple roles, influencing persuasion through either the central or the peripheral route, depending on the circumstances. For example, the expertise of the person delivering a persuasive message is often easy to discern and may therefore easily change someone's attitude without engaging a thoughtful response, persuasion via the peripheral route. But if someone is highly motivated and has the ability to think carefully, source expertise could function as an argument whose strength is carefully evaluated, such as with someone who's more apt to be convinced by an argument delivered by an expert source than by a non-expert. This results in more mindful attitude change, persuasion via the central route. Source expertise can also affect persuasion through the central route by influencing the thoughts people generate about the issue at hand. For example, people may be more likely to think of supportive evidence if the source is an expert. The upshot remains that there are two basic routes to persuasion, one involving systematic elaboration of the persuasive arguments, the other characterized by less effortful processing of relatively superficial cues. So is one route more effective than the other? Well, for long-lasting attitude change, persuasion through the central route is preferable. Through this route, people will attend to a message carefully and elaborate on it more deeply, increasing the chance of integrating the arguments into their belief system. The end result is attitude change that is more enduring, more resistant to persuasion, and more predictive of future behavior. By contrast, for immediate acquiescence of an audience not very motivated or attentive, the peripheral route is the way to go. Looking back, the elaboration likelihood model describes two ways of processing persuasive messages. When motivation and ability are high, such as when the issue is personally relevant and there are minimal distractions, persuasion is likely to occur through the central route, whereby people are persuaded on the basis of a careful, systematic analysis of a message, such as the strength of its arguments. When motivation and ability are low, on the other hand, attitude change tends to occur through the peripheral route, whereby people are persuaded by easy-to-process cues, such as the sheer number of arguments or the attractiveness of the message source. The elements of persuasion. Now that you have a sense of the different ways people can process a persuasive message, let's take a look at specific elements that influence whether a persuasive attempt works or not. Many of the studies in this area were inspired by research that Carl Hovland and his colleagues conducted at Yale University in the 1940s and 1950s. These researchers broke down persuasion into 3 elements, or the 3 W's of persuasion. 1. The who, or source of the message. 2. The what, or content of the message itself. And 3. The to whom, or intended audience of the message. Persuasion and celebrity endorsements. Demi Lovato is pictured here at the United Nations headquarters celebrating International Day of Happiness, part of a worldwide movement to increase recognition that happiness and well-being are as important to progress as economic growth. Source characteristics. Spokespeople for social causes are often rich, famous, and good-looking. For example, actor Matt Damon is co-founder and spokesperson for Water.org, an organization devoted to getting clean water to impoverished countries. Famous actress and singer-songwriter Demi Lovato has lent her name and influence to many social causes, among them the promotion of health and well-being. What are the effects of having such striking spokespeople? Questions about who delivers a persuasive message have to do with source characteristics. Let's take a look at some of the most deeply researched of these characteristics. Attractiveness. George Clooney, the handsome, award-winning actor, has spoken up on behalf of many causes, among them the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, Sudan. Glamorous celebrities often appear in commercials, singing the praises of a particular consumer brand or product. They're also the faces of public service announcements, urging kids to read, stay in school, or avoid drugs. One could argue that relying on the beautiful and famous in these campaigns makes no sense. After all, what does beauty and charisma have to do with, say, the merits of a cause or the quality of a product? But as we've discussed, attractive communicators can promote attitude change through the peripheral route. For example, we tend to like physically attractive people, see Chapter 10, and for good or ill. This simple fact makes us more likely to accept the attitudes they endorse. Research shows that attractive sources are particularly persuasive when the message isn't personally important to the people hearing it, and when those people don't have much knowledge in the domain. In other words, the attractiveness of a source is especially persuasive under circumstances that sway people to focus on peripheral cues. This doesn't mean that finding an attractive person to deliver a persuasive message is a waste of time when your audience is apt to be thinking about the message carefully. Attractive sources can lead to persuasion through the central route by, for example, increasing the favorability of people's effortful thinking about the position being endorsed. In short, it's hard to go wrong with having someone attractive deliver your persuasive message. Source characteristics. Characteristics of the person who delivers a persuasive message, such as attractiveness, credibility, and certainty. Credibility. Credible sources are expert and trustworthy. Advertisers try to take advantage of this. For example, there's no shortage of ads for toothpaste, aspirin, and other health-related products that cite testimonials from doctors known for their expertise and trustworthiness. More generally, the sheer credibility of a message's source can sway opinions under circumstances that promote the peripheral route to persuasion, such as when the topic is of low personal relevance to the audience or the audience is distracted. And when the audience happens to be highly motivated and able to think carefully, source credibility can be taken as a strong argument in favor of moving toward the position the credible source is endorsing. Martin Luther King Jr.'s credibility as the leader of the civil rights movement undoubtedly served as a strong argument in persuading people to join the movement. What about all the non-credible messengers who crowd the airways these days, the crackpots maintaining that the Holocaust never happened or that AIDS is not caused by sexual contact? Do these messages fall on deaf ears? An early study unfortunately suggests otherwise. 1951. Participants first rated the likelihood that a nuclear submarine would be built in the near future. At the time, they didn't exist. 5 days later, participants read an essay about the imminence of nuclear submarines and were told the essay was written either by the highly credible physicist Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, or by a non-credible journalist who worked for Pravda, the propaganda newspaper of the former Soviet Union. As you might expect, the Oppenheimer essay led to greater attitude change than the essay by the less credible Pravda writer. even though the content of the essay was exactly the same. Much more surprising, however, was that 4 weeks later, participants who had read the essay by the Pravda writer, although unmoved initially, actually shifted their attitudes toward the position he advocated. This came to be known as the sleeper effect. That is, messages from unreliable sources exert little influence initially, but over time have the potential to shift people's attitudes. The idea is that over time, people dissociate the source of the message from the message itself. You hear some irresponsible guy on talk radio arguing that the government is preparing to ban the sale of handguns. Initially, you discount the message because of the messenger's lack of credibility, but over time, the message has a chance to influence your views because you have dissociated the source of the message from its content. Down the road, the idea may not seem entirely far-fetched. Notice here that we're talking about how the ineffectiveness of a non-credible source can fade over time, allowing a message from a non-credible source to shift attitudes down the road. So how about a highly credible source linked to a weak message? The weakness of the message will surely hurt persuasion initially, but could the message get dissociated from the credible source over time so that persuasion is ultimately effective in the longer run solely because of the source's credibility? Indeed, it can. Recent studies document this new form of sleeper effect, whereby you get delayed persuasion by a credible source who is initially linked to a weak message, but down the road is dissociated from it. Credibility and persuasion. Martin Luther King Jr. is pictured here during the March on Washington in August 1963, and he is about to give his "I Have a Dream" speech. His credibility, due to his leading role in the civil rights movement and having repeatedly put his life on the line, undoubtedly contributed to his ability to persuade. Every time a message seems to grab us and we think, "I just might try it," we are at the nexus of choice and persuasion that is advertising. Andrew Hacker. Sleeper effect, an effect that occurs when a persuasive message from an unreliable source initially exerts little influence but later causes attitudes to shift.